Canada, the Financial Administrations Act, Article 19.1, Charges for Rights and Privileges. The Governor in Council may, on the recommendation of the Treasury Board, by regulation, prescribe the fees or charges to be paid for a right or privilege conferred by or on behalf of Her Majesty in the right of Canada by means of a license, permit, or other authorization by the persons or classes of persons on whom the right or privilege is confirmed. Now notice it says, the Governor in Council may prescribe the fees or charges. The Interpretation Act of Canada, Imperative and Permissive Construction. The Interpretation Act of Canada and the subsequent Interpretation Acts of each province. Application. Every provision of this Act applies, unless a contrary intention appears, to every enactment, whether enacted before or after the commencement of this Act. Shall and may. The expression shall is to be construed as imperative, and the expression may as permissive. The Interpretation Act of Manitoba. Imperative and permissive language. In the English version of an act or regulation, shall and must are imperative, and may is permissive and empowering. In the French version, obligation may be expressed by using the present indicative form of the relevant verb, or by other verbs or expressions that convey that meaning. The conferring of a power, right, authorization, or permission may be expressed by using the verb pouvoir, or by other expressions that convey those meanings. The Quebec Interpretation Act, Article 51. Whenever it is provided that a thing shall be done or must be done, the obligation is imperative. But if it is provided that a thing may be done, its accomplishment is permissive. In the Financial Administration Act here in Canada, when you look in that act, in Article 19.1, you see that it's written that the Governor in Council, meaning the Governor who at that time is in charge, may, now notice that word, may, by regulation, meaning by enactments or statutes, by regulation, prescribe fees to be paid for a right or privilege conferred upon you. So, they've already done this. They have prescribed through regulation many fees that you must pay. But it's not really you, it's your legal person, the artificial personality, that they are requiring to pay for this right or privilege. Now, such as if you want the right to drive, well, you're going to have to pay for this right. If you want the right to fish, you're going to have to pay for this right in the means of a permit or a license. As well as if you like to hunt, same thing, a permit or a license. If you want to own a business, if you want to practice commerce, you have to have a permit. Even if you want to have a dog, a family dog, you would have to have a permit or a license. And if you want to own a gun, again, a permit or a license. So every right or privilege that has been conferred upon your legal person must pay for that, must pay for it. But the human being has an option here, because this verse says the Governor in Council may. Notice that word, may. In the Interpretation Act of Canada and the subsequent Interpretation Acts of each and every province, the word may, as you see, is permissive. It does not create an obligation. It takes your permission. It takes your agreement. So, in the Financial Administration Act, Article 19.1, where it says the Governor in Council may prescribe through regulations fees that will be paid, may, it takes your permission. The Governor in Council has and is, by regulation, charging fees for rights and privileges already. However, the article says the governing council may charge fees. Now, it takes your permission. Again, it takes your consent. So if you want the rights and privileges that are conferred upon you on behalf of Her Majesty through regulation, through fees that you pay, then you're more than welcome to. However, if you do not want these rights and freedoms, these privileges that you must pay for, then you fall back on your human rights and freedoms, which you do not have to pay for, which afford you a lot more freedom than the certain limited rights and freedoms that you will pay for in this commercial system that has been established on behalf of Her Majesty. The more you become familiar about what's going on here in Canada, the more you look into your freedom and your rights as a human being, the more you're going to find that everywhere where you thought there was a liability or an obligation, there really wasn't. There was one if you accepted it, if you consented to it. However, because you didn't understand the wordings and you didn't understand the expressions that were being used, you thought that there was really an obligation that you had no choice but to accept and to carry. Now, the option is presented. The choice is there within the law when they use that word may. If you understand what is being declared. Now, a Canadian citizen is considered a legal person. A legal person. And all the rights and privileges that that Canadian citizen has, they must pay for. They must. And you see it clearly expressed in the Financial Administration Act, that these rights and privileges, which you get in the form of license or permits, there will be fees attached to them. Well, this is not for a human being. This is not for a man and woman. This is for someone who has been deceived into believing that they have to give up their fundamental rights to freedom to a government system or a commercial system that is in operation, that is fictitious. As the Canadian citizen, or that legal person, for example, you have a right to drive or travel. You have that privilege. And you can have a right or a privilege to own a dog. Now, if you have that right, if you can pay for that right through your legal person, therefore it must be a lawful right. If they allow you to express it, it must be a lawful right. They've just seized upon it and they want you to give money before you're allowed to exercise that right. But if it's a lawful right, then that means it's a human fundamental right. That means it's intrinsic to who you are. You can own animals because God or the Creator put animals on the land. And no one has the right to seize all the animals and say they all belong to me. And before you can own an animal, you have to pay me a little part of security or money to have a license to say you have the right or privilege to own an animal. Now, if you want to buy the animal from someone who breeds animals, that's different. But it's not the same thing as owning a license or a permit in order to have an animal. Now, it takes your consent to remove your fundamental right. It takes your consent. So that's why when you look into the acts, statutes, and regulations, when they are removing a right or a freedom and asking you to pay for it through a privilege, then they use the word may. They'll never use the word shall or must to create an obligation. They'll use the word may because it takes permission, permissive. And you, by giving into this, by going and paying these fees and regulations, well, you're saying that I agree, I accept, that you will take my fundamental human rights away from me and freedoms, and in turn, I will pay money or security in order to exercise these rights through my legal person. Now, a funny thing is, when I personally went to the SAQ, the automobile place here in Quebec, a couple of years ago to deregister my car, when I deregistered my car, the note that was put on the vehicle said that my person, because the name was written as my person has no more lawful right to travel. That was the word that it used, lawful right. And it said my vehicle had no more lawful right to travel also. So it was I caught that right away. It clicked right in my mind. I'm like, okay, so they make your legal person pay for rights and privileges that are lawfully the human beings. And then if you refuse to express this right through your legal person, they're saying that you don't lawfully have this right anymore attached to you, which is garbage. You have this lawful right as soon as you're born. And no one has the right to remove it from you. Nevertheless, they do it through their system, hoping that you'll never catch this and understand what's going on. So just keep in mind that every time you see the word may in every law that you're studying here in Canada, or in what you're looking for into your rights and freedoms, may takes permission. You have to agree. It takes your consent. And if you don't consent, if they try to force you, then they're holding you in servitude, and they have no right to do that, and it's causing you damage and a claim against them for breaking their contract obligation to the charters and the covenants. Canada, the Financial Administrations Act, Article 19.1, Charges for Rights and Privileges. The Governor in Council may, on the recommendation of the Treasury Board, by regulation, prescribe the fees or charges to be paid for a right or privilege conferred by or on behalf of Her Majestation, shall and must are imperative, and may is permissive and empowering. In the French version, obligation may be expressed by using the present indicative form of the relevant verb, or by other verbs or expressions that convey that meaning. In the right of Canada, by means of a license, permit, or other authorization by the persons or classes of persons on whom the right or privilege is confirmed. Now notice it says, the Governor in Council may prescribe the fees or charges. The Interpretation Act of Canada, Imperative and Permissive Construction. The Interpretation Act of Canada and the subsequent Interpretation Acts of each province. Application. Every provision of this Act applies, unless a contrary intention appears, to every enactment, whether enacted before or after the commencement of this Act. Shall and may. The expression shall is to be construed as imperative, and the expression may as permissive. The Interpretation Act of Manitoba. Imperative and permissive language. In the English version of an act or regulation,